For those who have just come or came midway through, my name is Eric Owens, and I'm the Interim Director of the Boise Center for Religion and American Public Life here at Boston College. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here, and I really look forward to the conversation that we are about to have. A reminder again, please turn the ringers off on your phones and the other devices you may have turned back on. I'd like to say again that, express my appreciation again for the co-sponsors of this event tonight. There was a lot of things that had to come together to get the film from the studio and get the exact right people here on the panel. And I want to thank the Center for Jesuit Spirituality for their long-standing support, the Institute for Liberal Arts, and the Church in the 21st Century Center, along with the Boise Center, of course. So thanks to you all for making that happen, and to our staff at the Boise Center for doing such a great job here. The panel that we're about to do will be recorded in audio and video, so if you'd like to go back and catch the exact perfect bon mot or insightful piece of wisdom that you hear, you can go back and do that soon. But also, there were a number of people who weren't able to make it, and you're welcome to share that from our website. That should be up within the next couple days at bc.edu/Boise, B-O-I-S-I. A quick announcement of a couple events coming up. A week and a half from now, there is a major conference on university ethics entitled Toward a Culture of University Ethics. A major interdisciplinary conference, 20+ speakers around a whole different set of issues around ethics on campus. That is April 5th through the 7th, and information is on our website as well. One other major lecture that we're having at the Boise Center is by the granddaughter of Dorothy Day, the American Catholic social worker, who's written a new biography of her grandmother entitled The World Will Be Saved by Beauty, an intimate portrait of my grandmother. That's Wednesday, April 19th at 5 p.m. in Gaston 100. So please do join us from that. We have many co-sponsors with that I'll mention there as well. Here at Boston College, in addition to the people that are on our panel, many of you in this room I know have read the novel that this film is based upon, taught it. Some of you have written or published books or articles on this theme. And I just want to acknowledge the fact that we have a lot of terrific wisdom in this room, and I'm looking forward to you sharing that with us, even though not all of you could be on the panel today. I'll introduce our panelists at the beginning here, and then let them go one by one. We've asked them to keep their remarks to between 10 and 15 minutes, and then we'll turn immediately to conversation with you and the audience. Our first speaker will be Dr. Hitomi Omata Rappo. She's a visiting researcher at the Institute for Advanced Jesuit Studies here at BC, under a postdoctoral fellowship from the Swiss National Science Foundation. She received her doctorate in history from École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris, as well as from the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. She has an MA in Asian Studies and a BA in Art History from the University of Tokyo. And in her doctoral dissertation, she analyzed how the images of Japanese martyrs, recorded at first in missionaries' reports, were reproduced in the hagiographic literature in Europe, and diffused as a popular theme of the Jesuit school drama in Italy, Germany, Spain, France, Switzerland. Currently, she's working on a book entitled From the Assistant Indies to the Scenes of Colleges, the Reflections of the Japanese Martyrs in Europe, 16th through 18th century, which will be published by Cerf in Paris. And you'll understand why she's the perfect person to lead off our conversation. Our second speaker will be Professor Robert Merricks, Associate Professor of History and Associate Director of the Institute for Advanced Jesuit Studies here at BC. His major areas of research and teaching include the history of the Society of Jesus, and he's published on various aspects of the history of the Jesuits, including St. Cicero and the Jesuits, including the book St. Cicero and the Jesuits, a companion to Ignatius of Loyola, and Jesuit Survival and Restoration, co-edited with Jonathan Wright. His interview with Father Jim Martin on Jesuit missionaries was recently published in the Journal of Jesuit Studies and is available on a link with the Boise Center website, our event page here. Our final speaker will be Father Richard Blake of the Society of Jesus. He teaches American film history and criticism here at Boston College. During and after his years as executive editor of America magazine, a national weekly journal of opinion, he served as a regular film reviewer. His academic interests had focused on religious themes and imagery in popular American films, and on the influence of New York City on Hollywood production. While at Boston College, he edited the scholarly quarterly Studies in Spirituality of Jesuits for 12 years. His publications include After Image, the indelible Catholic imagination in the works of 6 American filmmakers, and the book entitled Street Smart, the New York of Lumet, Allen, Scorsese, and Lee, both books look at the work of Martin Scorsese. So we have a terrific panel for you, and we'd like to ask Dr. Rappo to begin.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm sorry to talk from here. I'm 7 months pregnant, so forgive me to here. Oh, you can't hear me. Could you? Okay. So as most of you probably know, this film is a very faithful adaptation of a novel of the same name written by the Japanese writer Endo Shūsaku in 1966. While it is based on some research, the book Silence is above all a work of fiction where historical elements are largely adapted to fit the purpose of the story. In fact, as one can infer from both Endo's various testimonies and Scorsese's foreword found in a recent English edition, the book and the film were both designed to present a spiritual theme, to show the challenges of the faith in the modern world as a whole for Scorsese and for Japanese Christians in Endo's case. This general narrative has profound impact on their depiction of history. The story is set around the year 1640 in Japan. Almost a century had passed since Christianity was first brought to the country by one of the first Jesuits, Francisco Xavier, in 1549. The mission initiated by the Society of Jesus prospered in the first decades, and the number of converted Japanese grew to as much as 3 or 4% of the population, which is more than 3 times what it is now. However, through the centralization of the local political power since the mid-16th century, after long civil wars inside the Japanese archipelago, the Catholic faith was banished in the whole country by the authorities. At that time, the main destination of the missionaries shifted to China or Southeast Asia, and in Europe, Japan became the subject of hagiographical stories of heroic Christian martyrs who died because of the cruel persecutions conducted by Oriental tyrants. It was thus no longer an actual field of evangelization. Under these circumstances, the European missionaries were forced to enter the country clandestinely, like Sebastian Rodriguez and Francis Garfield in the film. This general context in the film is concordant with what contemporary sources tell us. However, many details were adapted or modified to better fit the story. For example, Ferreira was rarely a Jesuit active in the 17th century. He did send letters to Europe, and some of them are still available today. However, the plot device setting the whole story in motion, a presumed letter written by him in 1633, which is shown in the first scene of the film, was entirely and quite masterfully created by Endō. In the book, Endō uses a similar blend of history and fiction on several occasions. In fact, the main character, Sebastian Rodrigo, in the film, is also derived from an actual historical figure, an Italian Jesuit called Giuseppe Chiara. Alongside such historical figures, which include, of course, Ferreira himself, we also find purely fictional characters, such as Francis Garpe, who was designed by Endō in order to provide a contrast with Rodrigo. The events that brings the 2 missionaries to Japan, Ferreira's apostasy, is also confirmed by both Japanese and European contemporary sources. He took a Japanese name, Sawano Chuan, and died in the country, and this tombstone shows this information, which arrived in Rome around 1633, caused an important scandal, not only for the Jesuits, but also for the church as a whole. As you can see on this slide, later sources changed their tone and started depicting Ferreira as a martyr who ultimately died for his faith. However, before this happened, a group of people was actually sent in 1643 to verify what recall happened to Ferreira, just like Rodrigo and Garfield. Among them was Giuseppe Chiara, along with around 10 companions. Contrary to what happened in Endō's story, the missionaries were able to make contact with actual local Japanese Christians. In fact, while they made efforts to dress as the Japanese, they were immediately discovered as soon as they appeared due to their weak noses and captured after a quick boat chase. After his arrest, Chiara was finally convinced to abandon his faith. He took a Japanese name, Okamoto Sanemon, not Okada Sanemon, married and died a relatively well-off man after more than 40 years in the country. This contrasts sharply with depictions of him as a martyr, which were created in Europe at the same time. His apostasy is mentioned in the archives of the Jesuits in Rome, as well as in several Japanese sources, Kirishitoki, Sayo Yoroku, and Tsuko Ichiran, which we know Endō used to write silence. However, one can say that the books and the film's narrative neglects one important aspect of Chiara and Ferreira's legacy, their contribution to Japanese culture. They had in fact an important role not only in chasing Christian materials, but also in transmitting Western knowledge, such as astronomy, in the country. Endō wanted to show the conflictual relationship between a Japanese and Christian identity, and not their assimilation to the local way of life, which happened only after they abandoned, at least on the surface, their faith. The first main Japanese character we see in the film is Kichijiro. This extremely interesting character was probably based on one of Chiara's Japanese retainers. His incarnation in the book is best summarized by Endō himself, who says that Kichijiro is me. He meant that this extremely weak man, who was unable to die for his faith despite being given multiple chances to do so, mirrored his own struggle with his faith. As Scorsese says in his foreword, he is the Judas, the one who doubts, and his presence draws both a sharp contrast and fascinating parallel with Rodrigo, who wants to become a martyr but is not allowed to. He can be considered as a character central to the story. The next important Japanese character is the governor Inoue. This is an actual historical figure who served as an inquisitor for Christian matters from 1639 to 1655, and he indeed interrogated Giuseppe Chiara. The book and the movie tend to depict him as a rational but cruel figure who did not hesitate to kill many Japanese Christians in order to force the missionaries to apostatize. This description would better fit his predecessor, Takenaka Uneme, as Japanese historical sources describe Inoue as a far more moderate person who was not a promoter of extreme torture and was more inclined to try to solve situations peacefully. His dialogue with Rodrigo was completely created by Endō, and it is faithfully depicted in the film. Most arguments used by Inoue were taken from a book published in Europe in the late 17th century, where we can find what is presented as a testimony of a Dutch merchant present at the time of Chiara's trial. Now I will briefly assess the plausibility of the torture scenes shown in the film. The depiction of the particular torture, like like a suspension called anatsurushi, suspension over a pit, in the film are based on Western secondary sources such as Francisco Caldim. Excuse me. Now I will try to briefly talk about the torture scene shown in the film. The torture at the hot spring of Mount Unzen were rarely conducted by Takenaka Uneme, Inoue's extremely sadistic predecessor, who also was the first to conduct both fumie and the torture form called anatsurushi, suspension over a pit. The description of this particular torture in the film are based on Western secondary sources such as Francisco Caldim, Matthias Sterner, or Filippo Aregambe. According to Anesaki Masaharu, Japanese scholar, the actual procedure was to bury someone at the bottom of a pit so that only the head protruded. There was one particular torture which is absent in Scorsese's film, but can be seen in the Japanese version of Silence by Masahiro Shinoda in 1971. Actually used on Kierer, this technique consisted in tempting the missionaries with young Japanese women and forcing them to marry if they succumbed. We can find information about this in a Japanese source called Tsukoichira. Another technique largely used in the Edo period and absent in the film is udon house or chevrolet. There is as a whole, while the Japanese government conducted severe persecutions and did use sadistic tortures, especially during Takenaka Uneme's time, the government had changed its focus to a softer approach after 1628, and both Endō and Scorsese drew more from the imagination of the missionaries than from actual historical facts in their depiction of such scenes. The dialogue between Inoue and Rodrigo is another scene deeply linked to the historical context. It captures quite well the reason why the Japanese regime of the time was skeptical towards Christianity. In fact, the Japanese did not prohibit this religion due to their disregard for human rights or religious freedom, concept which did not exist at that time. It was a gradual process which paralleled the unification of the Japanese state. The first interdiction, promulgated by Toyotomi Hideyoshi in 1587, was not meant to cut all the contact with the West, but mainly to define a new relation based on commerce and other secular matters. It is only when the next leader, Tokugawa Ieyasu, understood that this would be difficult to achieve with Spain and Portugal, that contacts were restricted to the Dutch only. There are three main reasons which led to this situation from the Japanese point of view. First of all, the leaders who unified the country actively fought religious groups who held too much power inside Japan, and this was not limited to Christianity. Another issue was the fact that Christians were not able to integrate themselves in the existing religious framework where many traditions coexisted peacefully. Having seen what happened in the Philippines and in South America, Japanese were also afraid that the missionaries would be followed by armies. In fact, actual historical figures such as Jesuit Francisco Cabral clearly held the view that conquest would be the best way to evangelize Japan. In the scene with Inoue, but also with the translator played by Tadanobu Asano, where issues of discrimination inside the church are even mentioned, the movie succeeds in showing the complexity of the situation. While it does tend to exaggerate the depiction of Inoue as a pompous and unlikable villain, it does not try to say who was right or wrong, but rather focuses on the perpetual struggle of understanding each other across different cultures. In his later years, Endō lamented how the title of his book made people misunderstand him. In fact, the true focus of Endō's message was what happens to those who do not have the strength to become martyrs. The silence in the book title is not really the voice of God which Rodrigo was unable to hear as seen in the movie. It is, and this is shown in Rodrigo and Kichijiro's dialogue, the silent voice of such people, the common believers who are rarely mentioned in both Japanese and European sources. In a way, Endō wanted to destroy a history of Christianity in Japan, focused solely on the heroism of martyrs. No character of the book is completely right or wrong. They are like several voices in his head, showing his internal conflict. According to him, the fact that Christianity was not fit to grow in Japan, as said by Inoue, is not to be taken per se. It was a critique of the tendency to define the identity of Christianity as something fundamentally linked to the Western world. Scorsese's vision does share many common traits with Endō's. His focus on the figure of the doubter, the Judah, here Kichijiro, and on the fate of the local Christians shows that he at least partly understood what Endō meant with the idea of silent voices. He is also clearly critical of the act of martyrdom, which is shown as extremely selfish and unproductive. In this discourse, historical details are of secondary importance, but they still contribute to the general believability of this fascinating film. Thank you very much.
Why don't we invite our other guests up that's here and here. Professor Merricks.
Good evening. Can you hear me? Lord, I fought against your silence. It was in the silence that I heard your voice. With these final words of the Jesuit Padre Sebastián Rodriguez, director Martin Scorsese, born 1942, explains the meaning of the title of his movie. This title is identical with the 1971 film by the Japanese director, as we have heard, Masahiro Shinoda, who was born in 1931. Both movies are adaptations of a novel Chinmoku, Silence in Japanese, by the Catholic writer Shūsaku Endō, who died in 1996, who was also a co-writer of Shimoku's screenplay. Interestingly enough, in the reviews of Scorsese's film, critics have given little attention to its Japanese antecedent. In order to fill this gap, I'll attempt here a selective and hence very brief comparison of the two movies. The difference between Shinoda's and Scorsese's adaptation does not lie in the movie's plot. A mission of two Portuguese Jesuits, Rodriguez and Francisco Garupe, to find a mentor, Father Ferreira, who was thought to have apostatized or renounced his Christian faith as a result of persecutions, including torture and crucifixion, that the Japanese authorities inflicted on the Christian communities in the villages surrounding the harbor city of Nagasaki, incidentally the same city on which the Americans dropped atomic bomb some 300 years later in August 1945. Except for the initial and final scenes, which provide more historical context to the story and perhaps more interpretative nuance, the sequence in both movies is almost identical. Beyond the obvious disparity in cinematographic technique, the difference between the two adaptations lies, in my opinion, in highlighting different aspects of the same story. Scorsese, advised by several Jesuit official and unofficial consultants, including James Martin, SJ, whom I interviewed, as Eric mentioned before, for the last issue of the Journal of Jesuit Studies, focuses more on the true meaning of Jesuit ministry rooted in Ignatius of Loyola's spiritual exercises. Rodriguez's spiritual journey, as he visited clandestine Christians in a few villages, is a journey of being transformed by the needy fishermen and peasants, men and women, whom he serves through sacraments of baptism, Eucharist, and confession, which in the soteriological or salvific self-understanding of the Catholic Church of the time were the exclusive gates to Paraiso, or paradise. Rodriguez is moved by his flock's perseverance and devotion, even if, as he writes to his superior in Macau, Alessandro Valignano, he worried that, and I quote, they value the poor signs of faith, like crosses, icons, and rosaries, more than faith itself. The most transformative, it seems, is for Rodriguez an opportunity to forgive, through sacramental absolution, his guide, Kichishiro. He does it, even if somewhat reluctantly, 70 times 7. The last time, after his own apostasy, when stripped of his arrogant identification with Jesus of the Garden of Gethsemane and with Jesus of the Via Crucis, or Way of Sorrows, he is now able to offer what should have been the core of his ministry, love. An apex which evokes the conclusion of another film about Jesuit missionaries, Bruce Beresford's 1991 Black Robe, which is a namesake of the course I teach on Jesuits in film here at Boston College. And actually I'll recognize some students of mine sitting over there. So if you, over there too, so if you need some information about the course, please be quiet, be gentle. Just like in Beresford's narrative about the Jesuits bringing Christianity to Amerindians of New France or Canada, both Shinoda's and Scorsese's stories show an apparently insurmountable conflict between the presumably universal and only true message of Christian salvation and local cultures of the natives. The clash is best represented in Inquisitor Inoue's parable about the Japanese daimyo of Hirado and his 4 concubines, and his description of Christianity as an ugly, barren woman who should never become a wife. Shinoda seems, though, to highlight this conflict even more. The lack of music, if we do not count the religious chant of the faithful, either Christian or Buddhist, and music of nature, in Scorsese's adaptation represents Deus's, or God's, silence. Composer Toru Tokamitsu's, who died also in 1996, soundtrack in Chinmoku, which mixes contrasting exotic noise with harmonic Iberian guitar music, functions as expression of incompatibility between East and West. The sound of the strong wind and of waves striking the boulders of the inhospitable coast of the Japanese island, which accompanies the first scene of the Jesuit arrival there, is yet another way by which Shinoda conveys his message of the cultural conflict. Despite blatant errors in the historical preface to the movie, the writers of the screenplay for Chinmoku got one point right. The first missionaries, led by St. Francis Xavier, arrived to Japan protected by the guns of the naval power of Portugal. and colonial Portugal, the Jesuit Padre Sebastião Rodriguez's homeland, was in Inquisitor Inoúe's parable one of the 4 symbolic concubines, an ugly, barren woman that Japan was unwilling to marry. Thank you very much.
All right, our final panelist is Father Blake. So we can make sure we get mics. There you go.
Buonasera. I thought we were going to have a little tribute to Martin Scorsese to begin with, since his film. Am I live?
Yeah.
Okay. I originally did not want to do this, and the reason was I thought the audience would be filled with theologians and cultural anthropologists, and I'm a film man. So I was told it would be perfectly all right to talk about it as a film, which is what I'm going to do. Talking about Scorsese is something that always is tempting to me because we have so much in common. We're the same age. We're both products of the New York City parochial school system, Catholic high school. One difference was that he applied to Fordham and didn't get in because his grades at Cardinal Hayes were so bad. I was a nerdy little kid, so I got into Fordham with no trouble at all. Now, had there been a more insightful admissions officer at Fordham, Father Scorsese would have been giving this presentation this evening, and I'd be in a garret someplace in Greenwich Village trying to do my great novel. Well, what can we say about this as a film? Were you entertained? Were you delighted? Or was it acting?
Yes, entertaining.
It was a bomb. It is a box office catastrophe. It cost $46 million to make. So far, they've gained $20 million back with the U.S. and international distribution. And they may get some back on cable television, but I can't imagine the Netflix crowd gathering together to watch 3 hours of torture porn to rival the Passion of the Christ, which is what we had in this. I thought the last 35, 40 minutes were brilliant. Liam Neeson came on after 2 hours of this plodding narrative with no selection at all. Before that, what happened? Where was the misfire? How was the audience so misjudged? I mentioned that Scorsese and I are contemporaries, and I think the production team of the film really suffers from the same type of arthritis that those of a certain age are. I just jotted down some of the collaborators that were involved in this thing. Scorsese was born in 1942. The author, Jay Cox, was born in 1944. Thelma Schoonmaker, the editor, was born in 1942. Barbara Delfino, the producer, who was married to Scorsese for 8 years, was married in 1940, was born in 1949, and Erwin Winkler, the production supervisor, 1931. So it's a group that's sort of long in the tooth. Not only that, they were used to working with each other for a long time, which led me to a sense throughout the first 2 hours of the movie of extraordinary self-indulgence. They had done this before, they were doing it again. They say, why wasn't Thelma Schoonmaker, the editor, more insistent that you really don't have to watch 5 people, one after another, be led in front of the great Inquisitor? Well, it worked once, so we'll do it again. When Scorsese tries to go international, sometimes falls into cartoons. This was very much reminiscent to me of Kundun, the story of the Dalai Lama. And the Grand Inquisitor, for all intents and purposes, was a remake of Mao Zedong. Now, I'll just make a very quick reference here to some of the production involved in it. What Scorsese does, and he makes the same movie over and over and over again, with great success. He's one of the major artists of the 20th century, no problem about that. But there is a sameness to it, a structural homogeneity, no matter where he is, he's doing the same movie over again. He works in a pattern of concentric circles. So there's the dominant culture, the subculture, and then this tiny group within the subculture that keeps arguing and fighting for some sort of self-identity or integrity. The city at large, the mafia, the guy in Goodfellas that wants to go into the dope business but can't do it. Red China, Tibet fighting for its independence, the Dalai Lama and his inner sanctum, trying to figure out how to deal with their own integrity and yet save Tibet from being taken over by Mao. One movie after another, you get that same pattern of concentric circles, and they're repeated here. So you have Japanese culture, Christian culture, and then the conflict within the core of the Christian culture, how you maintain fidelity to that, and survival and compatibility with the larger culture. These are the themes that he's gone back to again and again with great success. Externally, some of the reasons for the colossal failure of the movie commercially, I don't think a group of that age would be quite into the attention span of the Snapchat generation. And drag it on and on. Another reason I would claim a credential as a contemporary of this crowd is that when I got into the film business in the 1960s, everybody was watching Bergman, Fellini, Bresson, the Italian neorealists, De Sica and Rossellini. And these kinds of theological inquiries transferred very nicely into film. We're now into a generation of comic books, Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, the Incredible Hulk, and computer-generated graphics where audiences want to see a lot of explosions. We don't get any of that in this movie at all. It's talk, it's thought, and it just seems to go on interminably. There's an axiom they used to have in film school that it's almost impossible to make a good movie out of a good novel. As I recall, Endō's novel is terrific. So much of it is interior action. If you transfer that into the screen, you have to have a visual equivalent for it. So it's almost cheapens or makes superficial the kinds of reflections that you'd get across in a novel very easily once you try to put concrete images on it. Scorsese is fascinated by religious topics, but I've been around this before. Last Temptation of Christ, he did with the same scriptwriter, Jay Cox, and it was the same protestation that he had all the time that religious questions have always intrigued me. Part of the problem is, those of you who are theologians know that you can't really address adult complex theological questions with high school religion. And once Scorsese left Cardinal Hayes High School, that was the last he had of formal religious education. So, and he struggles with a lot of this stuff. Sometimes he nails it beautifully. As I say, that's the last half hour of this, I think, is just fine. But it takes a long time to get there. And you've been listening to me for a long time, so I'll stop and turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. We have history on the table and film studies, and we have also, of course, all of the theology and the visuals of the film. So we'd like to turn, rather than what we would normally do, is I would interrogate them intensely and push their points and such, but you've been here for 4.5 hours now, and 4 hours. So let's turn it immediately to the audience for your questions or comments. And Father Matata, did you have something you'd like to start with? Did you say? Or? We have microphones for everyone to help hear.
My name is Matata. I came from Japan. I've been living in Japan for more than 28 years. And fortunately, I know Endō's family. I've been in the family, and I am also, friends of Endō's friends, like, for example, Gaston, Obaka-chan, he died already, and Yachiro Seiichi. Those are people familiar to Endō, and Miura Shomo, he just passed away, and his wife, Sonoya Rappo, wrote something about the movie. So I am really very happy that I watched the two movies, the one in 1993, and Endō, when he saw this movie, I want to start from a joke. He said, "That's not my silence." As you said, there were a lot of noises. I would expect or suspect that probably if you would have watched the film we have seen, maybe you would have said the same thing. But the problem of the book, as Father Blake said, is a very tricky and very deep books. I would talk on the level of theology or things. Endō emphasizes the silence of God. Why does God doesn't speak when we are in some kind of calamity? This is the problem. But at the end of the film, he does speaks. If you listen very well, he speaks. But in this case, God wanted the priest to be the one to choose for the life of the Christian and not martyrdom. This is very tricky questions in Japan. If you come from the south, for example from Nagasaki, where I consider Christianity, this is my word, I have been using it for the first time. I consider Christianity like a family religion. Because the forefathers who have been Christians and the people who become Christian there, it's not because they believe, because they became Christian, but because they became Christian because it's the forefathers who were Christians. And when you say that, for example, the silence of God, martyrdom is not very good things, you are questioning their faith. We have seen it in the movie. The second remark, maybe something like Hitomi Sensei, Professor said it, is this tense movement or contradiction between Christianity as it is brought from Western culture to other cultures. I tell you, if you are in Japan, in December 25th, all the country is Christian. And in January 1st, all the country is Shinto. So there is not a line, a border to say concretely who is Christians, who is Shinto. Everybody is in everything. And Buddhism is the most, because the family religions, the most accepted or adopted by people. So when you baptize one Christians, that means you have to leave all those things I have said, the cultural background. That's what Endō, in a way, is putting as a question. Today, for this moment, I checked what the Japanese people in Japan have written about the movie here, and how do they think about this movie? The same question as here is still God silent? They say no. He's speaking in a way people should have to know. But I think that it's good to know, mostly for people who are here or for those people who talk about Japan, it's not easy to go to Japan and say, that's Christianity, take it. They won't take it.
Thank you.
Because Christianity is somehow a foreign religion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. Let's take a couple of comments and then we'll come to the panel for any responses. Who else? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. We heard that Rodriguez was challenged on his faith, and he wasn't allowed to be a martyr. So my question is, if it is a question, is so he tried to preserve his faith. I mean, he tried to preserve his life as an instinct, but he couldn't become a martyr. So what that says theologically or to our faith.
Does someone want to take that since it's a direct question? Yes, go ahead.
Actually, this is exactly the Shūsaku had as a question of whole life. Because the silence, in the long essay about the silence, this novel, the original novel, that he wrote just only 4 years before his death, it was the longest account by himself about the silence novel. And he explained in that essay that the silence is also the historical silence about those weak people, poor people, who could not be dead as a martyr, as hero, and who could not remain themselves in the history, in the Jesuit history, in the church's history, in Japanese history. And the main object of this novel, according to Endō, is put emphasis on those weak people. So that is the novel itself is the answer by Endō Shūsaku. And clearly he says that Kichijiro is himself. He said clearly that in the history, when he were in the Edo period, he said that he would be apostatized. He is a weak person, and it's parallel with his own experience during the World War II. As you know, during the World War II, Japan was under the military control, and Christianity was considered to be the enemy's major religion. And the Christians were allowed to live, but under the control, under the surveillance. And he said that in his years, he was obliged to deny his faith in public or amongst friends. And he considered himself as a person compared to Kichijiro. So I think theologically, I think it's not be allowed, because in 60s, when just after 1966, when Endō published his silence, many churches, especially those in Japan, were protested against this novel. And in Nagasaki or Kagoshima, it was clearly prohibited to read among the Christians to read this novel. And the wife of the Endō was criticized in public during the mass by the priest, as the wife of the writer who wrote the novel like silence. So, could I answer your question?
Yeah. Great, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, others, comments, questions? Yes, behind you.
Yeah, I think there's some very interesting theological questions about whether the film is really supportive of Roman Catholicism, conventional Roman Catholicism, or not. And I hope people talk about that. But I read the book, and I thought it was very long-going, but enjoyable. And I also thought, contrary to Father Baker, I think that the movie was really, really good. And I lived in Japan for 2.5 years, and I thought the details of Japanese historically seemed very authentic. I would be interested in what other panelists thought of the movie as a movie.
Sure. Robert,
Well, I personally, generally speaking, I did like the movie, and I think my students could confirm that it's that the theme of the movie, as we watch many other movies in class regarding Jesuit missionary activity, the theme of the encounter between West and local cultures is it's a theme that was very important for any missionary activity, whether it was in New France or Japan or in Latin America, and the response and approaches were very different. So I'm talking now as a teacher who teaches a history class and uses movies to discuss different topics of Jesuit history. I think this is beyond, whether you like it or not, whether it's too long or it's not too long, whether you embrace the approach of the director. But for me, I think it's a wonderful material for teaching purposes.
Did you want to say anything about whether you liked the actual film as a film?
Film as a film, it's interesting, especially those who are familiar with the film of Kurosawa or Mizoguchi. Scorsese was known, I think he is known to be the amateur of Japanese Asian old film like Kurosawa and Mizoguchi. And I feel some scenes are homage to the scenes from the Kurosawa or Mizoguchi's film. For example, the interesting scene when Rodrigo was taken to Goto Island, there was a smoke all over and there was a ship, and it was extremely unstable scene. And I think it's a homage from the scene, especially placed in the Mizoguchi's Ugetsu Monogatari, Ugetsu story, taken by the famous cameraman Miyagawa Kazuo took that scene. He is suspending the camera with a rope to take the very unstable scene over the river. And I thought that cameraman knew about that technique, and he did the same thing to take that scene, I think.
Yeah, for my part, this is the second time I've seen the film now, and I appreciated it more the second time, I think, than I did the first. I think I was struck the first time. I'm an ethicist. That's my field, so not film studies and not history, so I can come at this in a little different way. I felt that the original film suffered. The first time I saw it, I felt as if the story suffered from melodrama. It was too much for me to appreciate the subtleties in the film. But on a second viewing, I saw a lot more, I think, of some of the glances and gestures and the dialogue that I had missed the first time, and certainly came to appreciate more of the uncertainty that was latent in the text around answers to the questions. As some of you have said before, things aren't painted, the answers aren't given. They're painted as tensions internally and across cultures. And so it can be unsatisfying for some of us to not get a judgment on the value of particular missionary work at a particular time, or judgment on a particular notion of salvation, or about cross-cultural transmission, or about responsibility for others' lives and things like this. They weren't all worked out, but that's what makes the novel and the film, I think, so pressing upon the viewer and the reader, that you carry those questions out with you, rather than simply critique the way that one director or writer has written those.
Well, your points are all very well taken, and I will maintain there is a difference if you're looking at a movie as an artifact, or if you're using it for something. I could see where it would be a great insight into Japanese culture, into an historical moment, or ethical questions. When I look at it, I'm thinking in terms of scripting, plot development, things that were extraneous to the movement of the narrative that really didn't help it that much. I can see it if you're looking at it for some other didactic purpose. There's a lot in there. And there was a lot in the movie itself. I mean, it did. The only Academy Award nomination it got was for photography.
I was reflecting a little bit while you were talking that I think Scorsese might have got a little bit confused because of the consultations of some Jesuits. Why is that? Because
not guilty.
That's why I'm speaking about that. I'm talking about it. Because if you compare the two movies, right, as I tried to do, you see that he goes at some point in a very different direction. That actually Jesuit ministry and Rodriguez as exactly his journey of understanding his ministry is the focus of the movie. And all the addition about how he understands silence eventually and how he dies, right? Which, by the way, Chimoku ends with a sex scene between Rodriguez and his new wife. So this is the ending scene in Chimoku. So it's very far from what I think, and actually in my interview with Martin, he revealed, right, that these were his suggestions, right, to recall these spiritual exercises, for example, and all this kind of thing. So, so eventually, you know, it is based on Endō's novel, but the last 30 minutes of the movie goes much beyond what in my opinion, Endō wanted to transmit, which is the strong conflict between original Japanese culture and the foreign invasion of Christianity.
We have other Jesuits in the room as well. I think I saw Jim Bretsky up there. Did you want to, I mean, I think one of the things that's coming up is questions of depiction of Jesuit theology. Do you, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know you've written on this and talked about it. Do you have a word or two about the Jesuit spirituality depicted here?
Well, I'm a Jesuit, and so a word or two, no, but several.
We'll set the timer.
I teach in the School of Theology Ministry. I have actually one of my students there in the second row who has studied the book in my cross-cultural ethics class, and I myself have lived not in Japan but in Korea. I would interpret the book. I'm not going to get into the movie so much, except I did think it was a good movie. I'm going to interpret the book primarily through the lens of the practice in Zen Buddhism of a koan. And the purpose of Zen Buddhism koan meditation practice is to break down established ways of thinking, rationality and what have you, so that you then would be freed for insight. And the moment of insight, satori, comes when Rodriguez hears the voice of Christ speaking to him. And from a Jesuit perspective, I would associate that with the special grace of the third week of the exercises, which focuses on the passion of Jesus Christ. And the special grace that we ask for in that is to be so identified with Christ that we receive, like Christ, opprobrium and suffering and what have you. I think that is also what goes on in the novel. Rodrigo has, I would say, an incomplete satori experience, an incomplete enlightenment, but that's life, this side of the Great Divide. And I think the last insight that I would have, and some others have said this too, is the strong influence on what is true priesthood. It's not all these things that he came to Japan thinking about, that he was going to do this, that, and the other thing, but it was being that earthen vessel of trying to mediate God's mercy, especially through the sacrament of reconciliation. And that is where the movie ends, with a reaffirmation of that aspect of his priesthood. And even in canon law, a laicized priest can always exercise the ministry of confession under, certain extreme circumstances. And so I would interpret it in that way. If you want to hear more, I'm giving a paper on this on April 8th at Boston U.
Thank you. Yes, a comment over here, and then we'll come back.
Thank you. Just two remarks, I guess. I was very interested in Dick's understandable interest in why the film, whether good or not, was a commercial bomb. and the possibility that it was because Dick Namai and Martin Scorsese's age group that kind of couldn't get out of its box. And it was interesting to me in that context to think about the conversation in which they decided that it would be Adam Driver and Andrew Garfield, two major young stars, but two major young stars in a kind of heroic mold, Batman-ish mold, if one thinks of their recent movies. And particularly as I thought about Andrew Garfield, I segue toward my other comment. Andrew Garfield in Hacksaw Ridge, in this same kind of movie moment, was an absolute icon of suffering in a similar way somehow, it seemed to me, that he was here. And although Scorsese couldn't have exactly planned that, there's something definitely going on in Hollywood about the depiction of suffering, about the kind of filmography of suffering. And that is a very kind of complex issue in theology as well. And I guess the second comment that I have to make about, as a moviegoer sort of, is that the scenes that most unnerved me here were scenes in which it was clear that the film wanted to depict an alien culture and its alien ways of making people suffer. It's alien, it's kind of pornography of punishment and torture. And the last time I remember being intrigued and having lots of debate about all of that was the scene in the war film The Deer Hunter, where the North Vietnamese are depicted in a kind of very melodramatic and alien form of making soldiers suffer. And it seemed to me that when I first saw The Deer Hunter, I remember thinking that right away there would be a very strong cultural debate about what to do about the fact that the other side in this war was being depicted as so unusually alien in the way that it inflicted torture. And yet I don't remember there being a cultural discussion of medieval Japan or early modern Japan in that context here. And I suspect that if it had been a more commercial film and critics had known that more people would have seen it, there would have been such a discussion. But if I were teaching this film, I would be curious to see whether students watching that had the same uneasy sense of a colonialized, eventually colonialized culture being depicted in that way.
Thanks. Let's get another comment. We had started here and then Jonas and then Doug.
Thanks very much for your comment, because I wanted to talk about Garfield and suffering, and you nailed it, so thank you very much.
All right, okay, you just pass it down to your right. Pass it down to your right, thanks.
Hi, I just wanted to ask about the historical accuracy of what was perhaps the more extensive theological discussion between Ferreira and Rodriguez about what the understanding of Japanese Christians was of the second person. Whether saying they really thought it was the sun as they saw it in the sky, or whether it was something more complicated. Do we have a historical record of what the understanding was historically?
Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. This is an interesting question, and many historians discussed about this question. First, Francisco Xavier tried to translate God, because otherwise, naturally he thought that it should be explained in the local Japanese language. And it was partly fault of one of his disciples, Yajiro, he met in Goa, in India, who took Xavier actually to Japan for the first mission in Japan. And apparently he misunderstood the meaning of the God and tried to translate into the equivalent Japanese. And it was not actually Dainichi, but it was Dainichi Nyorai, that means Mahavajrana. This is one of the divinity of the Pure school of Buddhism, and developed inside esoteric Buddhism during the Middle Ages, and paralleled with the figures of the divine figure of the sun in the Shintoism. So it was a very complex divinity figure, divine figure, throughout the early modern period in Japan. And it was extremely easy to understand that the divine figure brought by the priest, an alien appearing foreigner from India, and India was considered to be the original country of the Buddhism among Japanese, so they understand at first phase as one school of Buddhism. So it was extremely easy in that way, and it diffused very rapidly, got as Dainichi, another figure of the Buddhist divinity at that time.
Thank you.
So,
Well, thank you. Did you want to add anything?
Just one, maybe just a simple remark that historically there's a little bit of confusion. Actually, I was talking to Jerome before. He said, well, wait, Alessandro Valignano was much earlier, so he cannot be the one who sends Rodriguez and Garpe on a mission. But if you compare different Asian missions, you can observe certain evolution of approaches to local cultures. So Cabral, who's mentioned in the movie, represents a more colonial, so to speak, approach. Also, he had also plans of military invasions. And then there is a generation of Jesuit missionaries who come. Actually, Sarah was very good in making a point in her paper, she's my student, because she pointed out something from the reading that we did, right, for the class discussion, that the year in which Xavier dies, which is 1552, correct? This is the year in which who was born? Matteo Ricci. So this is entire generation, different generation, which comes from the training in rhetoric in Collegio Romano. Rhetoric that is more aware of the local circumstances and of more probabilistic approach and a tutoristic approach to local situations. And also, another thing that we discussed in class, the difference between Valignano, who was Italian, Matteo Ricci, who was Italian, Roberto De Nobili in India, who was Italian, was because, well, they did not represent any colonial power. Unlike Portuguese Jesuits or French Jesuits later on, who obviously, well, needed to be faithful both to the spirit of the society, but at the same time, well, represented their king, right? So I think this is interesting point to notice, which obviously the plot of the movie doesn't help to make clear these that kind of evolution. Yeah.
Other question? Yes, sir. He's got a mic for you. Coming just a second.
Yes. How would you compare the endings to The Last Temptation of Christ and Silence? Because in both films, of course, there's a very long, intense build-up, and then towards the end, the respective protagonists encounter a deeply existential decision between martyrdom and, I suppose, self-preservation or the preservation of life. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the Kazantzakis novel ends with a fantasy. It's a dream. It's the last temptation, and it's quite clearly a change of pace. Whereas Jesus has this vision on the cross: what would happen if I gave up this messianic role and lived the life of an ordinary person and had this fantasy of being married to Mary Magdalene. She's murdered by Paul the Apostle, then he marries Martha and Mary, and they have a family. Clearly a delusion from the someone on the verge of death. This one, I think, is very different in that they continue the pretense of reality, that he actually did die, and he actually was cremated as a Buddhist, and actually did have the crucifix in his hand. I don't think you have that sense of fantasy, dream, or delusion in this one that you did have in Last Temptation of Christ.
Good. Yes, Kyle? And then
My thoughts are a bit scrambled, but I want to address both the Oscar thing and the Hacksaw Ridge thing sort of at the same time, and then ask another question through that. So I don't know if you knew the box office figures for Silence. I don't know if you do for Hacksaw Ridge, but having seen both, I was struck by the violence and the way that it's used in both. And to me, Silence seems a lot more impactful. It's what I would say is quality, not quantity, of violence, whereas Hacksaw Ridge is just a barrage of terrifying images. And whether you think that plays a role in their appeal. And then second to that, the way that the violence is used in Silence, and also just the film in general, it's actually very beautiful, which sort of troubles me. This scene, particularly on the beach where people are being drowned, and Father Garupe swims out to them, is just gorgeous. It's visually amazing. And that sort of makes me uneasy, and I wonder if you think that's purposeful, or whether that does something for the film, or detracts from the film, or if you have no thoughts on it at all.
I have a number of different thoughts. I find it interesting that Hacksaw Ridge is a Mel Gibson film. He also gave us The Passion of the Christ.
Yeah.
And there were people willing to drum me out of the church as a horrible atheist, because I wrote a scathing review of Passion of the Christ based on my intrinsic dislike of torture porn. And it seems to me that Gibson was enjoying it a little bit too much, and in a little bit too much detail, and it just vitiated the whole film as far as I was concerned, so I hated it. I want to say something pretentious. I haven't said anything really pretentious tonight. I could be even more pretentious if I could remember the name of the person that said it. He was a French critic. He used the concept of sedimentation. And by that he meant that as you see more and more films, and as we produce more and more, a sediment gathers, so that you become more and more hardened against it. So a filmmaker has to be put in a situation of continually ratcheting up the stakes. So with computer-generated graphics now, you can have blood on the walls and brains on the ceiling, because audiences today need that. When John Wayne shot somebody in the 1950s, the guy would hold his chest and fall over, and that was the end of it. But now you really have to have dismembered bodies. And video games, I was trapped with a couple of great nephews playing video games one time. I couldn't believe the amount of violence that they were growing up with these games where they were really destroying one another. So I think it's an issue, an ethical issue for filmmakers. It's a cultural issue, an artistic issue.
Good question from Marianne Tinsdale.
Well, it's really more of a comment than a question, but if there's a reaction, I'm happy to hear it. I'm a theologian, and I'm one of those that uses film in my classes to illustrate dynamics, particularly in a core course I teach called Exploring Catholicism. And this year I'm having students read Endō's book, not necessarily see the film, and I hope they would, but there were a few here today, but it's obviously, the bomb is no longer accessible. But I often use a film that this film reminded me of a lot, and that is Shūsaku Endō's Der Neunte Tag, the Ninth Day. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with it. It didn't make it, in Hollywood, but it is on DVD. I think we get it on Netflix as well. And it's similarly based on not a novel, but a true story of a Luxembourg priest who is in the resistance in the Nazi occupation and sent to Dachau. and he's released ostensibly to see his mother who's dying, but he gets back to Luxembourg and finds out he's only been really released for 9 days to try to convince the bishop to go along with the occupation. The bishop's holed up in the chancery protesting the occupation. And it's the similarity in it, in the two films, is I think with the issue of a Judas character. And the commandante that he has to deal with, this Nazi guy, had once studied to be a priest, and I forget the true person's actual name, but the priest who was sent to Dachau actually has a doctorate and had worked with indigenous people in Australia, Aborigines, and wrote a thesis on it and so forth. And so a large part of the film is the dialogue. The priest does not cave in, and he's sent back to Dachau. But of course, it's on the eve of liberation, and he does in fact live, and his diary is what influenced Schlondorf to do a film about this whole story. But I'm sorry, I'm going to murder the name, but the character, Kichijiro, reminds me a lot of the same Judas kind of character, and I just wondered to what extent that was also in Endō's mind, that he was portraying him. I know I heard you say this is Endō in a sense, the character is Endō himself, but would he have considered his own weakness, as he put it, similarly as to that? Got a Christian trope, basically, of a Judas character.
Yeah. Actually, he also says that character of Inoue, character of Rodrigo, as well as the character of Kichijiro coexist inside himself. Actually, he thought that the idea of the Inoue, such as a representative of the representative of the Japanese intellectuals in the 60s, as the person who considers Christianism totally westernized to the faith and could not be adopted inside the Japanese society. And on the other hand, he fought against the person like Ferreira, who considers Japan cannot take the Christianism since this is the Western faith. So all the characters actually existed inside his faith, and it's his account about the silence.
Definitely, Shimoku is more explicit in portraying Kichijiro as Judas. So the arrest of Rodriguez by the Japanese authorities is an imitation of the arrest of Jesus in the garden. So it's very clear, and the Japanese authorities rewarding Kichijiro with the money, throwing the money on the floor, not on the floor, on the rocks of the river, next to the river. It's very obvious. Yeah. More obvious in Shimoku than in Silence.
Just a comment on the Schlondorf film is that similarly, the character, the Nazi commandant, in a sense like Rodrigo to a degree, argues with the priest, without Judas, no Christianity.
Thank you. We had a couple other hands up, and let's get brief comments, and then we'll turn the last few minutes into it. So, ma'am, you had your hand up for a while, and then you right here.
Me?
And we'll and here. Yeah.
Me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Let's try to be brief, because
Thank
we're
you.
going to wrap up.
I
Just
have
the
a
last
very
5
brief
minutes.
question. For someone who is fluent in Japanese, does the semantic connotations of Kichijiro have any resonance? Does it have a meaning that he chose? And I question whether he's obviously a Judas character. I think he may be more subtle than that. But I was wondering if Kichijiro has any transliterated value.
Well, Hitomi, that you can answer that quickly, probably.
I cannot understand what you are asking. Translator?
Does Kichijiro make any meaningfulness as a name, the syllables themselves?
No, but the interesting thing is his name inside the whole Japanese novels written is transcribed only using in katakana. Normally, the Japanese name at that time should be described in Chinese character only for those people, even for those common law people. And the meaning of the transcription only in katakana, that means phonogram in Japanese, is the understanding of the character, semantic character, semantic presence of this person from the point of view Rodrigo.
Okay, I just got
I
to,
just heard a question because it made me realize that in Chinmaku, at some point there's a fusion between Peter and Judas in the personality of Kichichiro.
okay, we have 3 quick comments and then we'll wrap up. Go ahead here and then.
Well, my question may not be appropriate for this panel, but I'd like to ask it anyway, Father. As a pastor, how would you respond to, if I were to say that, given that this film was a bomb, it was not only a disappointment, but also socially irresponsible, given the potential it had to cut to the core of the Snapchat generation, as you put it?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Pastoral response to the violence?
No, to the fact that this film was a bomb, given the potential it had to sort of cut to the core of the Snapchat generation. Would you call it more than just a bomb? Would you say it was like irresponsible? No.
Okay, no, let's put it on the table. Let's put them all on the table and then we'll come back to them. Thank you, right here. Amelia, yeah, right here.
Just quickly, we were talking about the fact that Shūsaku Endō wrote this in Closer to Modern Times, right? So what does this movie have to say to us in Closer to Modern Times, right? We talked about like the Jesuits, and we talked about the 1600s, but today, like in defense of Ferreira, you know, a deeply incarnational spirituality would say maybe find a way to be there with them, with the Japanese people, even if you have to give away the explicit Christian message.
Okay, thank you. And then one last comment, and then we'll sort of take up all this. Yeah.
I'm a Jesuit, 7 years a Jesuit, so still a young Jesuit in formation. 2 things. One thing I got from this movie is the power of a lay-led church. And Korea also had that same experience. Korea's church was really led by lay people. That's number 1. Number 2, I grew up in an Islamic nation, constitutionally, and I'm not going to mention the name because it's being recorded, but Carrera's way of being Christian, I find quite disheartening today, if it's done today, and that's how many missionaries behave today too. We go in and, you know, we'll see how we can do this, we're going to support them, but forgetting why they were there. As a Jesuit Society of Jesus, I took my vows to serve under the banner of the cross. And if I serve under the banner of the cross, but not saying it explicitly, by not bringing people towards Christ, then I think I'm doing a disservice to the church and the people who support me and my mission to go as a missionary to another country. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have a couple things on the table to wrap up with. Why don't we start on the bike and we'll go down the road.
Well, this is a tremendously contemporary, personal question that's being raised, and it's somebody said it's about history, it's about the Jesuit order. No, it's about everybody. We live in an alien culture, scientific explosion. We're all. I'm 61 years a Jesuit, so I'm a little ahead of you on that score. But there's still doubt, and when we'd like to get God to speak directly to solve the doubts and questions that we have, but He doesn't. So the question that is raised in the film, I think, is something that every educated, thinking Christian, Catholic, and I presume other religions would have to deal with. It's one other little plug. Ingmar Bergman made a film called The Silence, and he got to the same question in about 80 minutes.
Okay. Tell me, would you would you like to address any of these last few questions as we wrap up?
Yeah, I really liked the expression of the lady there of the pornography of torture. Yeah, but it was also described by Monsieur there as the beauty of violence. And it is interesting that already in the 17th century, the scene of martyrs were realized in the Jesuit theater as a popular topic, especially in German-speaking world. And those kind of scenes attracted many audiences, and some Jesuits talked that kind of scene of a martyr called the catharsis for the audiences, and it became the subject of the artistic creation. So it is interesting that these days always Japan is described as a really cruel, violent, and tyrant country. But as well as back in the 16th early modern period, it was also the same topic in the theatrical scene.
Well, I'd like to thank our panelists for their expertise. Thank you all for enduring and joining us on this. I hope that it gives you lots of food for thought for the weekend.